Stop Learning Wrong, the Counterintuitive Science of Mastery. There's going to be a little bit of interaction, so at a certain point, I'll tell you when I need you to get your phones out. But I want to preface this with the transition to self-regulated learning. Through a lot of our education, probably all the way up until the end of secondary school, we pretty much just had to do what the teachers told us to do, and then if we did that well, we probably got good enough grades. The transition to university, on the other hand, can take a lot of people by shock. Just for a little bit of context, I'm at UT Austin, where students are only accepted into, there's auto admission if you are in the top 6% of your high school class, if you're in a top Texas public school. These are students who are really, really used to doing very well. And I get the sense that there's also a lot of people in this room who are used to doing really well. A couple of years ago, I did a bunch of focus group interviews with undergraduates at UT Austin, and here are some of the things that they said. Back in high school, you just had a little more support just because your classes were smaller. I felt comfortable, like interacting with my teacher and the classmates. I walked into my bio class here and it was full, like 300 people, it's intimidating. I was fresh coming out of high school. I thought I could just do this homework in a day and get by, but then that didn't happen. Fall of university sophomore year kicked my butt. It was a really formative semester because that's when I started developing study habits and figuring out how to manage my time. I didn't really understand that practice problems are more effective than reading a textbook or reading all the problems. So yeah, I got to my sophomore year, first semester, and completely switched up. Just a quick question here. How many people here are in their first year of university? Just show of hands. Second year? Third year? Fourth year? And how many staff, faculty, and lecturers do we have in here? Okay. How many people relate to any of these quotes that are here on the screen? Are there things that you had to figure out as you were here? Inadvertently, a lot of the time we spend, both in the classroom and in our own studying, ends up being wasted. But we don't have that much time to waste. And so what I'm going to be talking about is not how do we make learning effective and get good grades, because I think all of us in this room kind of know how to do that. What I really want to talk about is how to make learning both effective and efficient, how to make better use of the very, very limited time that we have. So here's a roadmap of what I'm going to cover, and you're going to see this roadmap a few times. So we're going to start with metacognitive monitoring. Do I know what I know? Because we kind of need to start there. So I want to get you to get your phones out or your laptops out if you have that and go to, okay, the QR code is covered, but go to pollev.com/VYAN. The URL is in the top left. So pollev.com/VYAN. And hopefully this should work. But what you should see is this prompt on the page. I'm generally good at judging whether I have learned something or not. Yes or no. And I know we don't love hard binary responses, but I'm going to force you to pick either yes or no here. All right, great. Looks like it's working. Okay, let's see what most people are saying. Okay, most of you think, yeah, I'm pretty good at knowing what I know and knowing what I don't know. Let's go for another question. So this one is a check all that apply. Which of the following is a reliable indicator that you've learned? You feel engaged and interested in the material? You put in a lot of study time? You can answer the teacher's questions during class? You covered all the content in your class as well as in your own time? You answer the homework and practice problems correctly? You've done well on the exam. Which of these are reliable indicators that you've learned something well? I'm going to give you just a few moments to consider these options. And if you're interested in what other people are saying, we have a lot of people saying, yep, if I've answered the questions, the practice problems and homework correctly, maybe that means I've learned. Or if I did really well on the exam, I've learned. Who here did pretty well on their exams all throughout school? Oh, don't be shy. It's okay. You're here. How much of that can you still remember? How much of that content from secondary school, from your first year of university, from your second year of university, what percentage of that content have you retained? Hmm. Does that mean you learned it well if you got an A in it? Not always. Metacognitive monitoring is how we judge for ourselves how well we think we've learned. It's something that we're constantly doing. We're asking ourselves things like, how easy does this feel? Will I remember this later? Do I know it yet? Is my study strategy working? How confident am I? And this kind of monitoring is happening in the background all the time because we're using it to guide our decisions for what we do next. Do I stop studying? Do I study in a slightly different way? Do I keep going? This affects our behavior, so we would hope that our ability to understand and monitor how well we're doing is accurate. Now, in my class, I teach a bunch of undergraduate students. A lot of them are pre-service teachers. And these are students who should have spent a good amount of time reflecting on their own learning. And we also know they want to be able to keep their learning on for the future. So I do this little activity at the beginning. And I base this off of a study by Cornell and Bjork, 2009, where I showed people a list of 30 items. And I asked them, okay, study this list, and I only give them a couple of minutes. And then I ask half of the students, how many of these items do you think you're going to remember in 24 hours? And for the other half, I asked, how many of these items do you think you're going to remember at the end of the semester in 4 months? So here's a list of 30. How many do you think you're going to remember if I test you either in 24 hours or in 4 months? What should these numbers rationally be? Should one of them be higher than the other? Should one of them be lower than the other? What did people say? On average, in 24 hours, they think they're going to remember 14.7 of those words. And on average, they think they're going to remember 14.6 of those in 4 months. What's happening here? They've forgotten to take into account the fact that they're very likely to forget these words in 4 months, because the feeling now, while the information is in front of you now, it all feels really easy. And we often fail to project into the future and think about how we're going to remember things later. But the problem is if you're basing things on how you're feeling now, that's not always a good, reliable indicator of whether you're going to remember things later. And that will come to bite you in the butt if you simply choose not to study because you think you know it well already. Now, this is not the only example where people's predictions don't really match reality. So in every single one of these graphs, I've taken it from an empirical study in the cognitive psychology literature. On the y-axis, we have how much people think they're going to remember, or when I add in the other half of the graph, I'm going to show you that's going to represent how much people actually remember. And on the x-axis are different conditions of learning. So for example, in the middle one at the top, interleaving skills, we have block practice on the left and random practice on the right. Now, in each one of these, what we can see is a very similar trend line, except for the last one. But in general, the one on the left, people think they're going to do better on, and then the one on the right. Now I'm going to add in people's actual performance. And right off the bat, what we're noticing is people's actual performance is the complete opposite pattern from their own predictions. And it turns out there are many situations that we might find ourselves in where we think we're learning really well, and it turns out we're not, and vice versa. There are situations where we don't think we're doing very well because things feel difficult, but it turns out on a subsequent test, we actually did learn more than we thought. It turns out accurate metacognitive monitoring is really quite tricky. we don't often know what's good for our own learning. Now, why is this? So, knowledge that is indeed objectively well learned, that's strongly stored in there, that is easy and feels easy to recall. So we often mistake how easy something feels during initial learning as a sign that we have learned it well. But the problem is that it doesn't work in this reverse fashion. Feelings of fluency in the moment can give rise to illusions of learning. And that's what I really want to talk about to protect ourselves from those illusions of learning. Okay, so which of these are reliable indicators? It turns out none of them are. That just because someone's interested and engaged in the material doesn't necessarily mean they're going to recall things at the end. Think of the number of cool videos on YouTube that you've seen, the number of TED Talks I've watched that I was really, really interested in. How much of them do I remember? Barely any of it. Just because you put in the time doesn't mean you're going to get a lot out of that time if you're not using effective strategies. Just because in the moment you're able to answer questions, in the moment you're able to get the good grade, doesn't necessarily mean you'll be able to hold on to it and still use that knowledge into the future. We've all been there where we've crammed for a test, and if we cram for a test, we haven't learned it very well. So just because we can do things in the moment doesn't necessarily mean it's going to be good in the long term. So what I want us to do, and I'm going to be talking about, is how do we make sure that we're doing the things in the moment that will really support long-term retention? So what are these keys to both effective and efficient learning? How do we learn better in less time? All right, poll everywhere, back again. So if you're still on that screen, the question should have changed. Yes, agree or disagree. And I'm sorry, I'm only giving you a binary choice. The right way to learn will make learning feel easy. Okay, we're starting to disagree here. So it's about a 1/3, 2/3 split. How about this one? Forgetting is the opposite of learning. Oh, nice. Okay, we have a lot of people disagreeing. And we're going to talk about how forgetting actually supports learning later on. Now, how about this one? I need to see something over and over again in order to learn it. Agree or disagree? All right. Now, the question is, you're probably saying, well, do I mean necessary but not sufficient? Probably some of you guys are thinking that. So now I want you to grab a spare piece of paper if you have that near you. So either a piece of paper that you're making notes on, I'm not going to be looking at it or collecting it. Grab something to write with and something to write on. Now, without looking around to see where the answer might be near you, I want you to draw the Apple logo. Okay, so how many people here have seen the Apple logo before? Like once or twice in their life, at least? Yeah, okay. Maybe a dozen times or more? More than a dozen times? Ooh, okay. How about more than 100 times? How many times have you seen? You've seen the Apple logo quite a lot, probably. How many of you guys are very confident in the Apple logo that you drew? But you saw it hundreds of times. Okay, we have one person who maybe is very confident. How many people are not very confident that they've drawn the Apple logo exactly right? Okay. But you guys have seen it hundreds of times. How could you not know this yet? Okay, maybe a free recall test is difficult, but maybe you can recognize it. On poll everywhere again, you're going to be dropping your pin, and you're going to drop your pin on what you think is the correct answer. And now you can compare, or you could try to compare what you drew. Do you have the various components? Oh, okay. Your responses are not super coherent. You haven't all decided to go for one. It's kind of spread out across 5 different ones of those. The answer is B, so the majority of people have gotten there. But this should be easy if you are able to remember things as long as you've seen it repeatedly, right? What's the reason why we can't do this very well? What's the reason why very few people were confident at their own drawing, and we've got only about 60% of people, maybe 70% of people correct here? When I know this is something you've seen hundreds, maybe even thousands of times. Just because you see something over and over again doesn't mean you're going to be able to remember it, doesn't mean it's been well learned. These are failures to encode because we haven't studied it, because we haven't thought about it, because we haven't tried to draw the Apple logo many times before, and we haven't had to think about, does the leaf point left or right? Is the bite on the left or the right? We haven't had to think about the little bumpy thing at the bottom. We haven't had to think about it actively very much. And the problem is this could represent a lot of what happens in our learning if we let our learning simply be passive. If we just sit in our classes, if we just open our books and we just say, I'm going to study to learn, and only at the very end, right before the exam, test myself to see what I've learned. Because it turns out when you just read and reread or watch and rewatch, that doesn't actually get into your head very well. That is not a good use of your time because to actually learn, you have to practice. To get it in your head, you have to be practicing actively. So a lot of students will say, I'm going to study to learn, and then I'll test myself to see what I've learned. It turns out that the reality is that the act of retrieving and trying to construct the answers, trying to recall the answers, trying to apply the content, that in and of itself is a strong learning event. So Robert Bjork calls it retrieval is a memory modifier. Every time you recall something from your memory, you put it back stronger. You are changing the nature of what it is that you've recalled. You are connecting it with different relevant pieces of information. You are building those knowledge networks. The act of retrieval itself is a much better use of your study time than simply rereading or rewatching or listening. And the retrieval practice effect is a very, very robust, it's one of the most robust effects in all of psychological research. And in 2022, Yang et al. Published a meta-analysis looking only at the benefits of quizzing within classrooms. So it doesn't even represent all of the retrieval practice research. It just represents this very, very small subset. And even there, we're looking at data from almost 48,000 students across 222 independent studies. The average effect of having quizzes in classes to foster retrieval practice, doesn't even have to be a high stakes test, could be a surprise practice test. The average is a standard deviation of 0.5, so half a standard deviation improvement compared to control. Now, putting this in educational terms, it would be equivalent from moving a student from being in the 50th percentile to the 69th percentile. It's a big increase. The research that they include in their meta-analyses covered 18 different subject categories, and they looked at both for factual learning as well as conceptual knowledge, as well as applied problem solving. And you find nice large effect sizes of roughly half a standard deviation in all cases. So I'm teaching my class, and my class is cognition, human learning, and motivation. I teach about retrieval practice at the beginning, and I have a lot of students who will come to me after the first midterm exam and go, Professor Yan, I did what you told me to do. I totally did a lot of retrieval practice, and I still failed your exam. Why am I still struggling when I'm doing the thing that you told me I'm supposed to do? So this was a few years ago, and I went online, and at that point, a lot of people were using Quizlet. I don't know if people are still using Quizlet now, but I typed in my name and my course number and then looked at Quizlet to see what were the flashcard decks that people were creating for my class. So these are some screenshots from Quizlet's website where each row represents a different flashcard. So on the left is what's on the front side of the flashcard, and on the right, it's what's on the back side of the flashcard. Because I wanted to know, what are my students doing after I told them to go do retrieval practice? That first line says, if a student is capable of learning something, motivation often determines whether and to what extent they, flip to the back of the flashcard, actually learn it. Or, motivation plays a part in whether we continue to, back of the flashcard, continue pursuing learning opportunities, or pursue learning opportunities. They took fragments and bullet points from my slides and simply chop them somewhere in the middle. I'm not sure what led to this decision to chop it at this point, but that's what they were testing themselves on. Can I memorize the specific bullet point in Professor Yan's slides? Or here's another example, misconceptions. concept, term, definition, or not even definition. These naive theories constitute serious obstacles to understanding. That's what they were testing themselves on. Now, the problem is this is what my exam questions look like. According to drive theory, which of these is an example of how Michael could increase his kids' motivation to eat a healthy snack? A, punishing his kids by taking away a favorite toy when they eat an unhealthy snack. B, giving his kids a choice between eating a number of different healthy snacks. C, not having unhealthy snacks in the house and not giving his kids as much to eat for lunch so they're hungry. Or D, showing his kids an interesting movie about healthy snacks. Or, here's another example of my questions. Write a letter to a future college student on what you've learned about effective learning from this EDP 320 course. Make sure you answer both parts of the question. You may ask for additional paper if needed. A, give the student 3 suggestions for how they should be creating and organizing their notes. Explain why each suggestion will be helpful, referring to at least one type of cognitive load for each suggestion. Connect these suggestions to at least 3 different multimedia learning principles across the whole response. So my students were doing a lot of retrieval practice, but it turns out they were not doing retrieval practice at the right level because I was never ever going to test them on memory for a definition. I was never going to test them on their memory for a specific bullet point, but I wanted them to understand the content enough to be able to apply and use it. So something I've had to build now is that students need to match the retrieval practice opportunities to the level or depth that they're going to be needing to use that knowledge. Applied learning requires applied practice. But how do you do that for yourself if your professor doesn't give you enough practice questions? This is where Gen AI can be really, really helpful. Rather than using Gen AI to just tell you answers, something that you could be thinking about building into your own practice is using Gen AI to prompt you to give more retrieval practice. So an example that I've seeded one of UT's internal AI-powered tutors is I've seeded it with these example prompts. Create an example of a student using different strategies and ask me to identify what's effective and ineffective, what they are doing and why. Or quiz me on how certain strategies might be related to different cognitive processes. Or ask me to compare and contrast different concepts from the course that I might find tricky. There are ways you can use generative AI to shortchange your learning and just do things for you. But hopefully your teachers have not set up a course where you can get away with that, because what we really want to be doing is coming out of your time here at NTU with usable knowledge that is a valuable use of your time. And to do that, you can use Gen AI to help prompt you to think more deeply, because it's really hard to create these questions for yourself sometimes. Let's say you study something, you're reading some new textbook chapter and you feel like you haven't quite got it yet, so you want to read it again, and maybe you choose to read it again immediately after the first read through. Or maybe you read through it one time and then you go off, watch some Netflix, go take a shower, go eat something, and then you come back and read it again a second time. Now, let's first think about what is that feeling of ease or difficulty at the second go around of that chapter. Generally, what people tend to report is that in the top row in the yellow condition where you've reread it immediately after the first reading, people feel like it feels easier. People go, oh yeah, it's really familiar. I feel like I was capitalizing on the learning I was making. I was able to really add something new in the second rereading. It feels a lot easier. I think I've learned more. In the second example, where there's spaced time in between and you've gone off and done something else, your mind has gone off and not thought about it for a while, and then you come back, that feeling right in that moment feels a little bit more difficult. You're suddenly aware of how much you forgot in that short time that you went to watch an episode on Netflix, in that short time you went to go eat something. You're recognizing that, oh, I'm having to reach back into my memory to remind myself what I learned the first time, and I don't really feel like I'm able to capitalize and really make that many learning gains because I'm treading over old ground. And if we put words on these two types of instances, I might call the top one masked or crammed practice or cram studying, and the second condition, I might call it space practice. Now, if we test people immediately after that second rereading, oftentimes those who crammed do pretty okay. This is the reason This is a way a lot of students got through high school, is that we crammed our way through and it was actually okay for us. And then we go, yes, you see, that worked because I got my A. But we also know that if the professor surprised us with a test 2 weeks later and we didn't have a chance to revisit things, that cramming is really going to have hurt us. Whereas it turns out people who had spaced their reading or their practice before are going to be better able at retaining it. Now, I want to note here that in both of these conditions, and this is the format that a lot of experimental studies have taken, they have spent the exact same total amount of time on studying. It's the exact same time. The only thing that differs is how that time is spread out. And it turns out, again, one of the most robust effects in the cognitive psychology literature is that longer spacing leads to better retention, whereas massing or cramming leads to very, very rapid forgetting. Now, why is that? I kind of described it when I was describing the experience of that second rereading. At that second rereading, you are much more aware of how much you forgot and that you've had to reach back into your memory to remind yourself and to engage in retrieval, to remind yourself of what you had learned before. It turns out that when retrieval is a really, really powerful tool, it's extra powerful when it's paired together with spacing. Because if you try to test yourself right after you just studied, it turns out there's very little retrieval going on because it's fresh on your mind. You actually need to space things out so that you can allow yourself to forget, so that when you come back to it, you are actually engaging retrieval. Allowing yourself to forget is what allows you to learn. So as you think about going through your classes, don't just think about doing retrieval practice immediately after class. Think about giving yourself a little bit of a gap. Or if you're a lecturer or faculty in this room, think about quizzing your students on what they had learned last class. So if you do that at the end of class, just move those questions to the beginning of the next class. Give that little bit of spacing and ask people to recall, what did we learn last week? Or what did we learn in our last class? And we're not only returning to content twice. It turns out that really to maintain long-term learning, we need to keep using it and we need to keep coming back to it. But how often we come back to it or how frequently we come back to it is going to depend on how well learned something is. So if we just think about a typical forgetting curve, you have a lot more forgetting at the beginning and then it plateaus out. Initially, after the first time you learn something, you're going to forget things pretty quickly. That forgetting curve is going to be steeper. So you could go, for example, just one day or 1 or 2 days before studying it again, because it will have now gone out of your, it will be less fresh. You will be able to engage effective retrieval. Now, having learned it a second time or practiced it a second time, it's going to be better learned. And if something's better learned, it will be more slowly forgotten. So you can maybe go perhaps 5 to 7 days before you come back to it a third time, and so forth as you go off into future study. It doesn't mean that every single week you have to accumulate and repeat every single thing you've done in every single week before. Do more close spacing earlier on, and then come back for occasional periodic maintenance reminders, maintenance study. If you're an instructor, think about how you would build this into your course. Think about how you can create, design your lectures, your class activities, and then homework assignments or assessments that could help mimic the structure to make sure that any one topic doesn't only come up once or twice in your class, but it's repeatedly coming back and at expanding intervals so that you can focus more on the newer things each week. Okay, here's another way in which we want to be cumulatively practicing things. Now, typical practice and instruction, if I go online and look for examples of worksheets, they oftentimes look something like this, the same thing over and over and over again. If I open, for example, a stats textbook, I'll see the chapters and it'll be chapter 1, a bunch of things about chapter 1, and then at the end of each chapter, practice questions for that chapter. Chapter 1, practice problems for chapter 1. Chapter 2, problems from chapter 2. Chapter 3, problems for chapter 3. We oftentimes think that to be an effective learner, we have to be really organized and put everything in its little box and focus just on one thing at a time and make sure we got that one thing really good before moving on to the next. Now I'm going to go through a little quick demo, and I want you to think about that feeling of fluency as you are trying to learn the painting styles of different artists. Now, in these actual experiments that we ran, we told people that they're actually going to be studying 72 paintings, 6 paintings per each of 12 artists. I'm not going to have you guys sit through 72 paintings. I'm just going to give you a quick little sampling of what the experience would feel like for the participants in the study. So they were also told that I want you to study these paintings to learn the artist's painting style. Because on the final test, you're never going to see any of the same paintings again, but I'm going to show you new paintings by those artists, and you have to say who it is. So this is not memory for the exact painting, but we're trying to get them to generalize and extract some sense about the artist as a concept. And we did this in a couple of different orders. So there are many, many different sequences we could do, but let's just pick 2 sequences, one on each end of the spectrum. And on one end of the spectrum is showing all the paintings by one artist in a row before then moving to the next. We're going to call that blocked. So painting by Lewis, and you're going to see 6 paintings by Lewis in a row. I'm seeing people nodding. Are you getting a good sense of what Lewis's painting style is like? All right. How are we feeling about Lewis? Do we feel good? Do we think we can identify a new painting by a Lewis? Okay, let's try it the other way. All mixed up. How's your head feeling? Maybe by the time you get to a second painting by a previously seen artist, you're not really sure what that first one looked like. And then the final test will be a brand new painting by one of the artists, and you'd have to say who it is. In some of these experiments, we even give people trial by trial feedback. So we'll tell them, you were correct, the answer was Lewis, or you weren't correct, the answer was so-and-so. At the end of these experiments, we tend to always ask people, what do you think helped you learn better? Studying the artist one at a time, studying them all mixed up, or it didn't matter, my performance was about the same. How many people think that people said blocking was better? Put your hands up if you think that blocking felt better for your learning. Hands up if you feel like interleaving felt better for your learning. How many of you think it was about the same, didn't really matter? So, of these participants, and we've run hundreds of them through this now, the vast majority of participants think that blocking was better for their own learning. But if we look at whether they got more of the blocked artist correct or more of the interleave artist correct on the final test, we find that it is exactly opposite. And if we actually just calculate what percentage of the blocked artist they got correct and what percentage of the interleave artist did they get correct, we find that it's not really close. It's a 2-to-1 difference, 61% versus 35%. This should be something that people are able to detect, especially since we gave them feedback, whether they were right or wrong. And yet, we find that this was the pattern regardless. It feels easier to study things one at a time, but it turns out it's a lot better to study them all mixed up. And we had a few people who actually put their hands up for all mixed up. But I'm going to show you another example. It's not just with very visual categories like artist painting styles, but Doug Rohrer went to elementary math classrooms in Florida, and he had students learn how to calculate the number of faces, edges, angles, and corners of different polygons. And in one condition, he taught them one and then had them practice a bunch of questions on that one. So teach faces, practice faces. Teach edges, practice edges. Teach corners, practice corners. Teach angles, practice angles. Or in the other condition, he taught all four and then took the exact same number of practice questions, but then just mixed them all up. And he had students practice those all mixed up. I think they had 11 practice questions for each one, and the first few were kind of partial problems, so they're a little bit supported, and the last few were all full problems. Let's just pause and look at how well people do on the practice tests during those practice questions. So I think there was a total of 44 practice problems. In the blocked condition, they got basically everything correct. They learned one, practiced one, and then they did perfect on that one type of question. In the interleave condition, they learned all four, and then they had to practice them all mixed up, and they made far more mistakes throughout their training. By the end of it, they were only getting 81% of the practice problems correct. So if you're a student in these two classes, or if you're a teacher observing these two classes, you might walk away saying, blocking is so much better because they're not making any mistakes. They're getting all the practice problems correct. But he didn't just stop there. Doug Rohrer came back one day later and gave them a test on all four types of questions. So 24 hours later, that's how they did. Just one day later, those who are getting 100% and made zero mistakes, it turns out they basically learned nothing. They got 38% correct. Those who had to randomly practice, who had to constantly look at each question and think, what kind of question is this? Which formula was this? And comparing and contrasting and mixing up and constantly retrieving many, many times, going back and forth between the different question types. Even though they made more mistakes initially, it turns out that what they learned, they maintained far better. This is something that we see, that 100%, I'm doing just fine in the class in the moment, and then on the exam, I'm failing. That's a pattern that we see a lot as teachers. And the problem is that this is actually a normal feature of human memory. It's not the failing of the student. It's really a failure of the practice set. So I've done this with my collaborator in Canada. We went into science classrooms and we created quizzes to happen at the end of every week. So we told the teacher, I'm only going to ask for 12 minutes at the end of every week from you. And in those 12 minutes, I'm going to give people a 9-item quiz with 3 questions from each of 3 topics. And they are either going to be blocked or interleaved. So they're going to be mixed up, or it's going to be AAA, BBB, CCC on the quiz, or we're not going to quiz them on a concept at all. And again, we see at each step going from no retrieval practice to 1 retrieval practice that was blocked. That's about an 8% increase on a final test that was given a month later. And between blocked questions and interleaved practice questions, we see another 10% jump, a letter grade basically at each step. And this is performance 1 to 2 months after the content was taught in school. So this is at a pretty long retention interval. The only thing we added from the colored bars compared to the gray bars was a 12-minute quiz each week. The only difference between the yellow bar and the orange bar is the order of questions on that practice quiz. Very, very subtle differences can get you a whole lot of gain. This is why I talk about effective and efficient. It's not about being that super studious, disciplined student who does 6 hours of studying a day. It's making effective use of small amounts of time. So why does mixing up the problems improve learning so much? And really there's 2 main reasons why. So it does double duty. It hits both on the attentional piece. So especially when you have concepts that are related or confusable, things like the different artist paintings, things like the different types of math problems, all to do with polygons. Interleaving draws people's attention to the critical differences between those concepts. So they're learning how to direct their attention to understand how to identify, oh, this is a situation where this concept applies versus this is a situation where this other concept applies. This is going to be useful for almost any subject that we have that requires people to identify what kind of problem am I looking at. This is a big thing in math, for example, that students will memorize a bunch of formulae, but then come to the problems on the exam and not know which of the formulae apply to a particular situation. Or if we think about medical training, as a practitioner, if you're going to be, for example, a general practitioner, you're not going to be told, okay, today every patient that comes into you will have had a heart attack. And tomorrow, every patient that comes into you will have had stress fracture on their ankle. You have to figure out what is coming in at you from the full range of knowledge that you have accumulated in your head. The world comes at you interleaved, and we never know how we're going to need to use that information that we've learned. So practicing how to spot when something is relevant, that's something that interleaving can help with. And as I think I alluded to when I was talking about the math polygon example, is that because you're constantly going back and forth, you're actually doing a lot of retrieval practice. And that retrieval practice, as we heard, really strengthens your learning. The constant retrieving and reloading, that act of practicing how to get it from your memory is really, really helpful. And interleaving increases the number of opportunities you have to do that. Learning is not one and done. We do need to see things over and over again, but not all repetitions are equal. In fact, rather than just seeing something over and over again, what we really need to be doing is practicing those things over and over again in spaced and interleaved ways. Okay. I've talked about spacing, interleaving, and retrieval practice. These often fall under this umbrella term of desirable difficulties. Now, desirable difficulties, they're referred to as difficulties because these are strategies that appear to slow your acquisition. You might make more mistakes earlier on, and they engage learners more elaborately and effortfully in the learning process. And it's because of that effortful, elaborate process that they end up yielding better long-term retention, and hence they're desirable. It's not that every difficulty you introduce for yourself is desirable. I could try to learn Latin while doing a handstand and juggling balls with my feet. That's going to be incredibly difficult. There's nothing about upside down juggling balls with your feet that will lead to better long-term learning, because it doesn't mean that I'm more elaborately processing the information. So desirable difficulties, strategies such as interleaving, spacing, retrieval, that force you to actually think about the content in different ways and more effortful ways, and they lead to better long-term learning. And the thing is, it's really long-term learning because in the moment performance may be misleading. In each of these examples, if we look just at initial learning, studying versus testing, blocking versus interleaving, massing versus spacing, studying, rereading, blocked practice, massed practice can look better than their counterparts, retrieval, interleaving, and spacing. But if we look at a final test, we find that it is, in fact, the opposite way around. Going back to let's not be fooled into these illusions of fluency, or illusions of learning. Focus on making sure that you're doing the things that will support being able to recall something a day later, a week later, a month later. Doing that spaced practice and mixed up practice. So rather than thinking that the right way to learn will make learning feel easy, really the right way to learn will be the ones that engage these more cognitive processes in your head. And it's really hard for the teacher to do that processing for you. You have to do that for yourself as a student. So, what are things you can do to put this into practice? At the beginning, when you are new, you have a lot of different ideas and different facts and different concepts that are going to be floating around in your head. You're going to come out of a class and there's going to be a bunch of new things and very little connection between them. Eventually, the goal, however, is that you're going to be creating those networks. You're going to be creating those connections in your head. So we want to think about, if we're going to put things into practice, how might we move up this trajectory? What are the things that we can help support ourselves and make sure that those nodes are properly there in the first place, and then shift to thinking about how do we make those connections between those nodes? So potentially, here's one suggestion. There are many different ways. I'm not saying this is the only way to go about it, but here's just some ideas. Before those nodes are very solidly there, During class or initial learning, potentially be more selective in your note taking rather than trying to write every single thing down, because the moment you try to do that, you stop thinking about the content. Instead, think about the content and try to be selective with what are the main ideas, how you might organize things. Relate new information to prior information. Maybe create your notes page in a way where you have space, maybe a right column, to actually draw connections to other things that you've learned in other classes. Create a space for yourself to write questions for yourself. For example, noting possible areas of confusion would be another thing to do. If you are also writing questions for yourself, you are automatically creating retrieval prompts for yourself. So in your note taking, you'll also be creating ways for you to support that longer term learning as well. And in the class, you might leave class feeling like, wow, that was a great lecture. I got everything. Don't assume you know it just because it feels fluent and easy at this point. And then you're going to practice over time. So initially, from the more novice phase, you might do more scaffolded or guided practice. Scaffolded or guided practice to get learners to retrieve specific content. So it might be something like, what is the difference between meiosis and mitosis? What are the key similarities and differences between animal cells or plant cells? Very specific questions that you can write for yourself or find. Maybe you can look at your textbook chapters or the lecture slide headings and cover up the content in the paragraph or the slide and use those headings to try to guide yourself into remembering and recalling what was the information that's relevant to that heading. You can use quizzes and flashcards. Use generative AI to quiz you. You can do think, pair, shares with your classmates, both in class, if there's room for that in the class, or in study groups or asynchronously on discussion boards. If you have study guides provided, look at those questions or subheadings. If you don't have study guides provided, you have the lecture slides oftentimes, or you have textbook chapters. You have something with headings or subheadings, and you can use those and cover up the content to quiz yourself. You might start with more focused, more blocked practice before then moving on to more interleave practice. So really, you could start with the most recent content, blocking that, and then maybe save 20% of your study session to do interleave practice. You might repeat this with increasing intervals. So let's say each day you say, I'm going to do review of what I learned, whatever was in my classes from yesterday. And then also a quick practice of whatever was in my classes the last few weeks. So you can think about dividing your practice time in a 80-20 fashion or a 70-30 fashion. More recently, which would be shorter spacing, more blocking, and then some piece of interleaving and spacing. Now, over time, as you become more and more advanced, you now really want to make sure you're interleaving and mixing the order up. Less structured retrieval practice. So it could be a more general essay-based type question or an application question where there's not one clear answer. It could be, what are all the ways in my class, for example, it could be, what are all the ways in which difficulty might impact your learning? And then it gives you room to really think about difficulty as a good thing, difficulty as a bad thing, difficulty as a neutral thing. You can use that to explore the space and practice coming at the content from various different angles. Practice making connections across topics. Another thing you could do is if you're going to do flashcards, pick 2 random flashcards and try to see if you can find a way to connect them. Practicing getting to the content in various different ways. Teaching others is a really, really good way to do these, because when you teach someone, you have to structure it, organize it, put in your own words, come up with cool examples. You have to understand where the misconceptions are. You're actually doing a lot of traversing through these different connector nodes, and you're practicing those connections. Writing essays or just full-on brain dumps. What are all the things that I know about something? Blank piece of paper, just try to write down as much as you can. Or even trying to create concept maps from memory. If this is content that is amenable to creating those concept maps, try to think about how different things are related to each other. So now I want us to take a few minutes. So I'm going to set my timer for 90 seconds. And I want you first just to think for yourself, what is one easy thing you could add to your regular studying? All right, guys. Sorry to interrupt, but I'm glad to hear people chatting. One last section, habits versus motivation. One idea that we have about good students, that good students are motivated. They're just motivated and excited. They really, really want to learn. They're going to do all the things all the time. Is that though realistic? Can you be this motivated student all throughout the semester? Can you be this motivated student all throughout all years of your university? Because it's not just one class that you have to deal with. It might be many different classes that you have to deal with. It might be many different types of assignments and papers that you have to read and things that you have to write. And then maybe some of us are doing research internships or volunteering or other type of work. But we also need to make space for the other parts of our life. We need to be able to relax and we need to feed ourselves. We need to maintain our fitness. We need to maintain social relationships. We need to have people who we care for and we need to take care of. That's a lot of things that we have going on in our lives. And the reality of being an adult is that you have to think about a lot of different things, not just the courses. And I hear that there are people at NTU who take a really, really heavy course load. I heard up to 8 courses is not super uncommon. So that's a lot that you guys are doing. And I don't know about here, but back in my university, I have a lot of students who are working part-time jobs or full-time jobs. They're taking 4 or 5 courses while also working 40 hours a week. My students have a lot that they have going. It can't be possible to be the super motivated, let me do all the things all the time. Because time is the one thing that we have really, really, really limited. And then oftentimes when we are at the end of a really busy day, we don't want to work. We just want to scroll on our phones. So the problem is that we can't drive all of our study behaviors through motivation all the time. That we can't be fully motivation driven. We actually have to think about habits. And habits are really, really powerful because a lot of the times, even when you do have energy, sometimes it just feels hard to get started. Instead of starting, we scroll on our phones, and then by the time we're done scrolling, it is way too late, and we decide, you know what? I'm going to call it for today. I'm going to do it tomorrow, but it's always tomorrow. Tomorrow will always be another busy day. The wonderful thing about habits is habits are activities that we automatically engage and initiate without much thought or willpower. You don't have to be super motivated every single morning and night to brush your teeth. You don't have to think about, wow, I really need to brush my teeth and I love brushing my teeth because it's so much fun. Or I love brushing my teeth and I need it and it's important because I don't want to have to pay for expensive dental bills and deal with dental issues in my future. That's not coming across my mind every single time I brush my teeth. It's the morning, I wake up, I'm sleepy, go into the bathroom, and my hand automatically goes for it. Before I know it, the toothpaste is already on my toothbrush, and the toothbrush is in my mouth. And then maybe I might start thinking, but it's the initiation of the behavior that doesn't take any thought or willpower because this is just the natural thing that I do in the morning. Habits are regular behaviors that we engage in even when there's no upcoming deadline. So I'm not going to be talking about how do you prepare for an exam. I really want us to think about what are the things that we're doing in a regular week that will help us later when that exam comes. Now, habits are highly dependent on contextual cues. For me, the brushing the teeth it's the morning time and I'm walking into the bathroom. For other people, they might have other types of habits. For example, my parents have a very strong habit of going for a walk after a meal. So it's tied to the act of having a meal. Now, I want us to think about what does this mean for study habits? When you study, are there times where it just feels easier to start than others? Are there places where it feels easier to start than others? Are there places where you sit down and you find yourself scrolling on TikTok instead of doing your work? That's not a good conducive environment, does not a good contextual cue to trigger automatically a study behavior. Think for yourself, are there ways in which you could create contextual associations that will help trigger that studying much more automatically for you? And then once you sit down to study, is there some habit that you can do rather than open up the first page and read? Is there some habit you can introduce to yourself and say, maybe the first thing I do is try to do a brain dump or try to write down the main ideas of what I learned? Think about what you already do, where you already do them, and how we can augment to bring these habits more regularly into your lives. And if they're passive rereading habits, how do we augment them to make them more active, perhaps retrieval habits? What we really want is, what I really would love, and would be the ideal, is if the majority of the semester you have small but effective habits. Maybe it's simply, I'm going to make a few notes for 10 minutes at the end of every class, and then at the beginning of every class, do a quick 5-minute retrieval. Or it might be something like, when I'm walking from one place to the next, maybe because on Tuesday and Wednesdays, you have a 30-minute walk from one part of the campus to another. During that time, I'm going to do some retrieval practice flashcards. Or maybe you know that after classes, you have a long wait before your bus and you like to hang out with a particular friend. Is there maybe 5 minutes of just teaching each other what you could do, what you learned from that day that you could do? Small, short. An effective habit is not, I'm going to study something for 5 hours. It's how do we make good use of the little pockets of time that we might have? And when we do that, how do we make sure it's not just rereading? That is the part where you want to develop an effective habit. And the beautiful thing is that habits, this is a good time right now to develop a new habit. The beginning of a semester, when you have a new schedule, when you're in different locations across campus, habits are best formed when there is some transition or change period in your life. Right now, this is a good time. Use this time instead of waiting for midterm and exam season to come around. Because midterm and exam season is too late for habits. That's where you just need the more intentional, intense, motivation-driven practice and revision period. And we can use all the things we talked about. But before we get there, we want to make sure that that intense period is not overly stressful, because I know you guys have a lot going on. If you do these things earlier on in small ways, that can make your exam period life far, far better for you. So vagueness is the enemy of action. It's easy to intend to do something, but much harder to start. So I want us to think about that thing you wanted to add to your studying and make a plan to start. So here are some examples. I want you to write down an implementation intention that takes the form of when, some type of event or time, I will, some kind of specific habit action. And really all of this is to save you time in the long run. Here are some memes that my students in my class submitted. Realizing I have a test coming up, realizing the class teaches how to study effectively. Stress management, not having to worry about cramming as much, not feeling like you have to catch up on so much information, not having the amount of information feel overloading and overbearing. This is what we want to be doing by creating better habits that have you studying more frequently and earlier on so that you can save time and save anxiety later on. All right, thank you guys very much.